My name is Bertrand. I work at SentryOne. We're based out of Charlotte, the United States. We make a tool called Plan Explorer, which is a free query tuning tool. I hope you're using it. If you're not, if you're looking at execution plans in SSMS, I hope you fix that. Use our free tool. No strings attached. You don't even need to use or enter your email address. I write at a bunch of places, mssqltips.com. I post answers on DBA Stack Exchange, and I blog in a bunch of places. Blah, 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 blah. Let's get on with it. So a couple of disclaimers. The first thing, the first few times I gave the session at least a few dozen times. And the first few times I gave it, the feedback that I got was that I was very condescending. That I was very making people offended that I would dare to say that they were doing something wrong in SQL Server. And I want to make sure that nobody takes offense to the things that I say, even if I might go step over a line about certain habits. I learned all of these things because I did them. I performed all of these things I'm going to talk about. The way that I came into SQL Server, I was doing all these same things. So it's not, I'm not preaching, I'm not up on a tower saying I'm better than you and you're doing things really poorly. I'm trying to help everybody be better at T-SQL. The slides, which you can already download, I already posted them to the SentryOne, blogs.sentryon.com. There'll be a link at the end that you can see where you can go download the slides. They're already up on the conference website. I don't know how long the organizers take to put those up there, but they're already all up there and available. All of the slides, or almost every slide, has links in the notes to provide more background. Right? The slide is just a bullet. I talk about it here, but I go into a lot more depth in some of the blog posts or posts written by other people that I refer to. The most important thing for me, so I was standing outside of the room before coming in while the other session was still going on, and someone came up to me and asked me, I'm a 10-year DBA, am I going to get anything out of that session? Are you in here? Can you raise your hand? Where is that guy? He doesn't want to admit it. All right, so he said, will I get anything out of the session if I've been a DBA for 10 years? And I believe so. There are bad habits that I still do that I don't talk about here because I don't want to tell everybody that I still do these bad habits. But there are definitely things that I do that I know I should do in a better way. And it can take a long time for you to get out of a bad habit or to even realize that it's a bad habit. So what my challenge to you is I want everyone in this room to take one thing away from this talk. And I do a pretty good job of making sure that everybody in the room gets something out of it. I don't expect anybody to learn something on every slide or something on every bullet. I expect that a lot of this is like, oh yeah, I knew that, and that's fine. But I want to make sure that there's at least something in here that surprises you or that makes you think, oh, maybe I should do that in a different way. So that's my goal. And if I don't do that for everybody, if anybody doesn't feel that I've taught them at least one thing, please come and tell me, because then I need to adjust this presentation and maybe cover some different angles. Okay? So I separated this talk into five sections. The first one is about coding conventions and what we do when we're writing code, how we format code, how we name things. The second one is about dating responsibly. So we do a lot of work with date and time in SQL Server, and there are a lot of ways to mess that up. The third one is about getting predictable behavior. So there are a lot of things that you can do in SQL Server that lead to ambiguous results or not consistently reliable results. And then querying efficiently, there are a couple of tricks that I've learned over the years that help you get faster queries with no difference in results, but just a slightly different way to do things. And then I have one slide on staying employed. Right, so there's a couple of things that can happen in SQL Server, and I can help you prevent those from being an event that requires you to freshen up your resume. So some coding convention things. Conventions are preferences. I see a lot of people out in the public, out on forums and on Twitter, saying you have to name your objects this way. Right? You have to use plural table names. You have to use object underscore verb as your store procedure names. Now, there's no right or wrong way to perform most of these things. So what I always try to tell people is just make sure that your code is self-documenting. Right? You shouldn't be making obscure and cryptic names or ambiguous names of things that require comments for someone to figure it out. Right? And I always say, that the actual standard you choose isn't important, right? If you want to name all of your stored procedures SP, well, USP underscore, whatever, that's fine. I don't really find any value in a prefix to denote what type of object, just like I don't put int in front of my integer columns. But some people want to do that. The important thing is that in your organization, that everybody is consistent and everybody's on the same page and agrees on the naming convention, right? So it doesn't matter which convention you pick as long as you all use the same one. When you start having different naming conventions inside the same database, that's a real problem, right? Tabs versus spaces, though, no, there's no argument here, right? How many people are tabs people? Spaces? How many people don't care? It's just white space. Yeah, all right. So just pick a convention that makes sense and be consistent. So this was a Twitter exchange I had a couple of weeks ago with someone at Microsoft, and he was arguing that you should put a prefix on every object type, right? So you put USP for stored procedures because you don't want to use SP. That's a reserved thing and causes problems. TBL, table name, like, oh, it's so bad because if you change a table to a view, that now you have a view that's named TBL, right? Because you can't go change all of the code. And I just feel like it's redundant information. There aren't many cases where you can be confused about whether something that you reference in code is a stored procedure or a function. I mean, there's different syntax, different semantics around those things, and you could never point me to a piece of code that references a stored procedure, and I would think, is that a table? There's just no case where that would be true, right? Most of these things are very self-describing. Anyway, some more things about coding conventions. Please be liberal with begin and end. I see a lot of people type if, and then if they only have to do one thing after the if, they don't bother putting begin and end around it. And so when someone else comes in and inherits the code and starts looking at it and they say, oh, well, if this condition is true, I'm doing this one thing. Well, I also want to do this other thing. And then they wonder why that other thing happens every single time, regardless of the if condition. It's because the if without begin and end, if there's only one condition, it's shorthand. You don't have to include the begin and end. But I feel like you should always put that. And I actually had an argument with one of my good friends last week about putting begin and end around the body of a stored procedure. Not because it does anything semantically, but just because it's a visual indicator of where the stored procedure is supposed to start and end. The go is actually the thing that makes that stored procedure end. Carriage returns and indents. Just readability is so huge, and I see people post on Stack Overflow all the time these stored procedures that say create procedure foo as, and then the select goes 8 screens over. I'm like, how do you even read that? Right? Nice carriage returns and indents. It takes you an extra microsecond to hit enter. Just do it. It's just much better to read the code. Table and column aliases. So a lot of people will put select from database name.dbo.table name, inner join database name.table name or database name.dbo.table name 2 on database name. Oh, geez, it becomes so hard to read that code when you fully reference the object every time you put it in your code. But don't use things like ABC. I've seen customers A join orders B, join sales C, and then you have all these references down later on in the code, and you're like, what was C again? Use a sensible alias that actually makes some reference to the original object. Stored procedure parameters. Very important to always name your stored procedure parameters. And the reason is that if you have, I see people do like exec sp who active, or sp who to active, but they don't specify the parameter name. With a system stored procedure, you're pretty safe. But with a user stored procedure, what happens when someone changes the parameters, adds a parameter to the beginning of the list? Now, at least if you name the parameter, you know that it doesn't matter what the order of the parameters is, right? You could also get bitten the other way. If someone renames the parameter, then your code breaks because the name points to a parameter that no longer exists. I feel like adding and removing parameters from a stored procedure list much more common than renaming the parameter name. Keystrokes. Don't shorten things to save keystrokes. I see people name tables with no vowels because it's faster to type with no vowels, but it isn't. And it's really hard for people to parse. I have a guy at work that all of his messages are acronyms for things. So it doesn't really land here, but LMK means let me know, and Y or U instead of YOU. Like, he shortens all of his words because he thinks that he gets so much productivity out of typing fewer characters. But he doesn't care that if he sends that email to 400 people now spend 10 minutes parsing his message to figure out what all these acronyms mean, instead of just typing. You know, if he had typed the word once, then 400 people don't have to reverse engineer it to figure out what it means. It's the same thing with SQL code. It's the same thing with object names, all of those things. Properly defined variable length data types. This one catches people a lot. So you have a variable that is declared as a varchar, and you don't specify the length, and weird things happen, and I will show you. Casing, so uppercase versus lowercase. A lot of schools of thought on this. I've come to a pretty consistent standard that I use that I think I can justify and that I think I can convince people to use, and that is lowercase the data types. So when I first started, I uppercased everything except for entity names, right? So I would say select, and I would say declare at foo, and then I would say the variable, the data type would be int, and I would put it in uppercase. And then I learned that some data types are actually case sensitive. So if you have a case sensitive collation, even just at the database level, and you try to declare a variable of type geography, and you type geography in uppercase, it fails. So what I do now is I always match exactly what's in sys.types, because I never know when my code is going to be deployed to a case sensitive instance, right, or a case sensitive database. And I might not have control over that. And so I always want to match what's in sys.types, so there's never any chance of collation causing a problem. Exact case for entities. This is easy now because IntelliSense makes this really easy, right? You type dbo dot, and then you find your object name in the list, and it puts the uppercase on the first character, the uppercase on the middle character, whatever, however your object is named. If you don't do this and you just type, I see a lot of people just type everything's lowercase all across the board. And then, again, you deploy that to a case-sensitive instance, and now suddenly all of your code fails because the object name is wrong. Can't find the object name in the metadata. T-SQL keywords, you want to be uppercase select, uppercase from, lowercase select, lowercase from, proper case, so the S in select is uppercase and the rest is lowercase. Whatever. It's never going to matter. Collation is never going to make those keywords case sensitive. Just be consistent, just like I said at the beginning. You know, make sure that your team is all doing the same thing so that when you're passing code around and someone's editing your code, you're all doing it the same way. Right? Keeps readability high. Semicolons. How many people put semicolons on the end of all their statements? Not many. Yeah. So I doubt it'll ever happen, but leaving semicolons off is deprecated. So it's possible that at some point, SQL Server, you'll upgrade to a new version of SQL Server, and SQL Server will make all your statements that don't have a semicolon fail. So please start using semicolons, just in case. I doubt it'll happen in our lifetime because of how much backward compatibility problems that will cause, but it's possible, it's been announced, you've been warned. Okay? Always use schema.object notation. How many people use dbo dot every time they reference a table or reference a store procedure? That is way higher than most audiences. Most audiences is like 2 people. So that's good, but the rest of you that didn't raise your hand, I'm going to show you why you want to do that. Okay. All right. Everybody see the screen okay? Text is good in the back? Okay. So I'm declaring a varchar variable at x, and I'm setting it equal to my name. And it should be nvarchar because I used the n prefix, but forget about that bad habit for a second. So select x is equal to @x, and y is equal to convert to varchar. This, I'm not going to try to butcher this and pronounce all of these words, but that's the east station in Warsaw to the station here in Wrocław. Did I butcher that? I butchered even that, didn't I? It's okay. All right. Okay, so the results are my varchar variable that I assigned the value of Aaron became A. Okay? So it went from 5 characters to 1 character. It's kind of an odd result. The convert to varchar trimmed off most of the, that's not really very big, is it? So there's the x, the variable got truncated to A, and y got truncated to something less than I originally defined. And the reason is that in some cases, if you declare varchar without a length, you get 30 characters, and in other cases, you get 1 character. And so there are different scenarios. I'm not going to tell you which scenarios get 1 and which scenarios get 30 because you'll use that, right? And you'll say, oh, well, in this case, I always get 30, so it's okay. It's not okay. Always define your length, right? And the reason is not just because you'll get this truncated data. The data that you lost is gone. It doesn't get logged, doesn't get error. There's no error message. There's nothing. It's just silently tossed aside. So if you have a stored procedure, right? You have a stored procedure. So let's create this table called oops. You have a stored procedure that takes in 3 parameters, nvarchar, nvarchar10, and another nvarchar, right? And it's inserting data into these nvarchar max, and nvarchar columns in the table. So I'm going to create this stored procedure. And I'm going to execute it. And I'm putting in some, more than 1 character of data. Here's some data, here's more data, and even more data. And then we run that. And now what got stored in the table is 1 character, 10 characters, and 1 character. I got no error message at all that said that, hey, you lost some data here. And so if my unit tests around this stored procedure, let's say I deployed this stored procedure, or I just made a change to it and I forgot to add the length to the parameter I added. If the unit test said, well, make sure that a row got inserted and that no error message was raised, right? Unit test passed, integration test will pass, and now you're going to deploy the stored procedure and you're going to be losing data until you realize that you've lost data. And you will have to do that yourself, right? Not good. Yeah, okay, let's go back to the, all right. Dating responsibly. So be aware, or beware of date time shorthand. So how many people use date add, date diff, date part? We use those functions all the time, right? All right, now keep your hands up. People who use those functions, keep your hands up. How many people would say D instead of day? Keep your hand up if you would say D instead of day, or M instead of month. How many people say Y when they're adding a year? Why wouldn't you type year? Why would you type Y? If you're going to type 4 characters anyway, type year. Make it readable, right? And I'm going to show you why that's important. Regional formats are also a problem. Over here, you guys like DMY, right? We don't like that in America. I think it's stupid. I think what Americans do is stupid. MDY makes 0 sense. I think the rest of the world has it right, but Americans are stubborn. They will never change. We'll never get the metric system. So we have to deal with these problems where when you see 05, 09, 2019 on a screen, was that written by an American or anyone else on Earth? You don't know. How do you know? And so when you are writing SQL code and you say, oh, well, I'm going to type in DMY and pass that in, that can lead to problems, right? Depending on who's reading it, what the settings on SQL Server, what the settings on Windows are, how that gets interpreted as it gets passed along from the end user on a website all the way through to the database, and then gets displayed on a report and interpreted, right? Especially if people are storing their date-time data in bad data types like varchar. Someone reads that on a report, and it could change meanings 5 times along that process, right? Because different systems and different people will expect it to be MDY versus DMY. Between. How many people use between to do a date range query? So you're running a report and you say between this date and this date. Okay. I'm hoping that I'm going to ask this question again at the end or after the demo because between is very bad, right? So you have a report. You want to get all the data for February, right? Finding the beginning of February, super easy, right? You use date from parts, year, month, 1. Year 2, 1. What's the end of February? I bet I would get 10 different answers for what the end of February is, right? What does it depend on? It depends on a couple of things. So let's say we have this example here. We've got a timeline, right? Just think about a visual timeline of the calendar. And you start at February 1st, and the next month is March 1st. Right? So the last day of February is usually February 28th, but not always, because we have leap years. So that makes it fun to calculate between. How complicated is the code that you have to use now to find the end of February using and to add to a between clause? You have to say, is the year divisible by 100? Is the year divisible by 4 but not by 400? Like there are all these logic rules, right, that you have to use to determine whether that leap year's there. So that's not good. Wait, someone was saying something here? And 1 day before? 1 second before? 1 millisecond before. Okay. All right. So remember that he said that. He said subtract a day or subtract a millisecond from March 1st. Okay? So with date, if I say give me the end of February and my date time and my data type is date. So let's say my parameter to my store procedure is date, or the variable I've declared is date, or the data type in the view. So let's say I have a view that says convert to date. The data type there is date. So when I say give me the end of February, the end of February is February 28th at midnight. So this, I don't know if I can do this. Let's see. Yeah. So this little section here represents the amount of data I've missed if my data type is date and I put that at the end of my between clause. Right? I've missed all the data from February 28th at 1 second after midnight until the end of February. So my report is not accurate. If I use small date time, well, my inaccuracy became a little bit smaller, but now it's going to round whatever date I pass in there. If I have a date time variable and I subtract 3 milliseconds, which is the trick, right? Date add millisecond minus 3 of the beginning of the next month, then what I'm getting is 2359.997. But when I pass that into a small date time parameter, or the data type in the column is small date time, it gets rounded down to the nearest minute. So it becomes 2359.59 or 2359.00, which means I miss the last minute of the day. Which you think, that's okay. I can lose a minute, right? How much happens in that minute? But do we want our reports to be accurate or not? Right? It gets more fun. Date time becomes 2359.59.997. Now remember, when you write the code that says, I'm just going to subtract a millisecond, right? You're dealing with the data types that you have at the time. Those could change later. People will change the parameter to a store procedure, or will change date time to use date time 2 because of some new standard in the company that says you're always going to use date time 2. With date time 2, the end of the day is 2359.59.9999999. Sorry, did I say 7 nines? 7 nines. Right? So there is still the possibility that when I'm passing in these times and they're getting translated to different data types, what am I doing here? The end of the month shifts slightly, and it leads to inaccurate reports, right? To miscounting data or double counting data if something happens to get rounded up. So you translate something in the reverse order, and it gets rounded up to midnight of the next day. Right? Okay. So for the shorthand, I asked about D and M and Y, right? So I want to show of hands. I want everybody to participate, please. This is like the only time I'll ask you that you have to do something. So if I say select date part W of today, how many people believe that that will be 21? And you have to pick one. How many people believe 20? Couple? How many people believe 2? A few. The rest of you just refuse to participate? Come on, make a guess. How many A's? How many 21s? 20. 2. Okay, good mix. And then date part Y of today. Not Y, just Y of today. What is that? Is that 19? How many 19s? All right. How many 135s? You just guessing. The heck is 135? How many 2019? A bunch. Okay. All right. So the majority there, first one was kind of split. The majority for the second was, was 2019. Let's run this and see what we get. Oh, it's 4. So this demo was supposed to be for Monday, the workshop that I missed because of planes. Okay, so anyway, so the first one is wrong, but the answer is 4. Anybody explain what that is? Weekday, thank you. So W stands for day of week, not week. Most people would assume that if you use week, you could save some typing by just typing W. That doesn't save you here, right? Date part Y, 135. That's not the year. What is this, Gregorian calendar, Julian calendar? What's going on? Chinese New Year? What's 135? Day of the year. Y is short for day of year, not year. Not intuitive. Spell it out. Type, if you mean year, type year. You're not saving anything by typing Y, and you're actually getting wrong results. Right? Even M is confusing because people think, oh, M must mean minute. Right? It actually means month. Right? Spell it out. Some other shorthand that's fun. How many people use +1? Select get date +1, get date -1. Nobody? Come on. Okay, we got 1. All right. So works fine with date time. Right? This works okay. I get a result. Date time 2. I get this bad error about operand type clash. All right? So the new date time types that were introduced with SQL Server 2008, they don't handle they don't play nicely with all of the things that the old date time types handled. All right, regional formats. So in US English, these 3 formats, 2019.05.12, 2019.05.12 with dashes, no space, and a time, or MDY, obviously. These will all produce May 12th, right? I know the grid. I don't have control over the size of the grid. Those all produce May 12th. Now, if I change my language to Polish, and I run this same select, they're all December 5th. How many people thought that all 3 of those would change to December 5th? 1, 2, 3? Not many. So you have to be careful about the way that you construct literals that you pass in as date time strings to SQL Server, because depending on the language of the user, depending on the regional settings of the machine, it's going to be interpreted incorrectly. When I first learned about this, the middle one especially caught me off guard. Using the ISO standard of Y-M-D, I think I tried it in French, and French got it backwards. And I was like, oh, the French, of course they would. Because why? Why would that ever be? Nobody in real life would ever say Y-D-M. No one would type a date that way. And I've given this presentation 35 times or whatever, and nobody has ever told me why someone would type a date backwards like that, YDM. But for some reason, SQL Server does interpret it that way. So the safe formats to use, MMDD, no dashes. With the dashes in, it's vulnerable to regional setting interpretation problems. The ISO format with the T in the middle that specifies that you're separating date and time. So you can use the dashes, but you also have to put the T in there. Otherwise, you have problems. And then you can also do MMDD space time. As long as you don't have dashes, that will never be interpreted regardless of the language. More than half the languages in SQL Server that are supported in SQL Server, I think it's almost 2/3, interpret DD-MM. They interpret it that way. Right? So the default installation for most people is US English, but with almost any other language, your odds of having that being interpreted incorrectly is pretty high. It's safe for the date data type, so date will never misinterpret YYYY-MM-DD as the opposite. But this is one of those cases where, yes, there's an exception, but don't learn from that. Just use the YYYY-MMDD all the time. Right? It's not as pretty, it's not as easy to read, but you shouldn't be forcing users to have to enter this because they should be using a drop-down, right? Or a calendar picker or something where you control the format of the string that gets passed to SQL Server. So you don't ever have to worry about this. Right? A lot of people take a date that a user enters. How do you know if I type M/D/Y, how do you know what I meant? How do you know where I'm from? Just because I'm using a computer and I'm in Poland and you're using my IP address to determine, oh, he's in Poland, or oh, his regional settings are Polish, that doesn't mean I'm Polish. That doesn't mean I'm not American, right? And using a stupid format for my date. But you're going to get my date wrong if you assume that I'm using DMY, right? So just be careful about that kind of thing. All right, predictable behavior. So merge. I had a conversation yesterday with someone about merge. Merge has a lot of things wrong with it. It seems like handy code. I feel like it gives this inaccurate promise that it's one statement and one operation, and you don't ever have to worry about race conditions or any of those things that go wrong when you separate a bunch of statements out. And in fact, the operation that happens behind the scenes with merge is just like you wrote the operations yourself, except that you have much less control over the individual execution plans because now there's just one execution plan. So if you pass in 20 rows to update, and the merge statement will help you compile an execution plan that helps get that update to happen. And then if you call it next and you want to insert 400 rows and delete 6 billion rows, you're going to use the plan that was generated to optimize for updating 20 rows. That's not really good, right? You're much better off being able to optimize those individual operations separately. Some weird things happen. If you have a trigger on insert, update, delete, it will fire 3 times. Right? It will fire for each operation separately and independently, but the add@row count in each trigger will be the sum of the operations. That's nice and intuitive. So if you have an operation in your trigger that says if add@row count is equal to 0, don't bother doing anything, and you have a merge statement that fires, that you delete 50 rows and update 0 rows, and your update trigger says, or the portion of your update trigger that says if add@row count is equal to 0, if add@row count is greater than 0, go do this thing. Even though you didn't update any rows, it's still going to go do that thing because it's taking the sum of the insert, update, and delete operations. Right? There's a requirement with merge if you're not using with update lock or withhold lock on the target table. So how many people use merge today? Let me ask that. All right, so keep your hands up for a second. You're using merge. How many people use with update lock against the target table in your merge statements? All right, so all the people that had their hands up but put them down, you're vulnerable to race conditions because you're not properly encapsulating the operations of the merge statement into a lockable transaction. Right? So you have two merge statements that run at the same time. You're going to have the same kind of race conditions as if you have update, update, insert, insert. It's the same thing. Right? So you have to put with update lock on the merge on the target. And if you go to this URL, bit.ly/merge with caution, there are, I think, 16 bugs listed there that haven't been fixed that include wrong results bugs. Wrong results bugs are bad. Right? So please reconsider using merge in all of the merge scenarios you have. There's some common myths about order. People think that a table or a query has a default order. Right? So if I say select star from table, every time I do that, it's going to come back in the same order. Well, that's not necessarily true. Right? Don't rely on order. If you expect a certain order, say so. Type order by that order that you expect. Because if you don't, if you leave out the order by, you're telling SQL Server, I don't care about order. Right? So I've seen bugs reported against software where the form on the web page has the data listed in a certain order because it called some view that said select star from table and didn't specify an order clause anywhere. And for, I don't know, 6 months it came back in the same order every time. Then the table hit some threshold where a different index was used to pull the data, and now it came back in a different order. Well, that's a bug. Well, it wouldn't have been a bug if you actually dictated what the order by should have been in the first place. The outer query has to obey an inner order. So you have a CTE, or you're calling a view, or you have different ways that you can nest statements, right? You can have a subquery. And if people think that if you specify order by anywhere, that order by will traverse all the way out to the outer query and will return your results in that same order. Same thing with group by. People think that if you say group by something something, now I don't have to specify order by because it's obviously going to come back in the same order as my group by columns. That is also not true. Right? Top 100% order by. How many people use this somewhere? It's okay if you do. He's not recording you guys. He's just recording me. You can put your hands up. It's all right. All right. Top 100%. What do you think that does? You want that order. So did you know that since SQL Server 2000, since just after SQL Server 2000, that top 100% order by is just optimized away? SQL Server looks at that and says, okay, you're using a top clause. The problem is that top is overloaded. So SQL Server says, oh, he's using a top clause. So he wants the top n number of rows ordered by this. So the order by is not actually there to dictate what order the results come back in. It's how you pick your top. But SQL Server says, so he wants a top number, and he wants it ordered by this. But the top is 100%, which means all the rows. Therefore, I don't need to order by because I'm not going to be leaving any rows out. So I don't need to pick rows. I just need to give them all. So if you look in a query plan for a view that you've stored top 100% order by in, you see it didn't perform the order. There's no sort anywhere. That the optimizer will process your query in a specific order. So you have the classic example is you have is numeric, right? So you have a table that has a varchar column that stores numeric values sometimes, and you want to get all the values that are numeric and apply some calculation to them. So you filter out the rows that aren't numeric. The problem is that in some cases the calculation can be attempted to be performed before the filter. So you try to multiply a column by 5, even though the result only returns rows that have a numeric column there, it tries to perform the calculation first, even though it's later in the query. So people think that SQL Server will read the query in the order they wrote it, and that's not really what happens. Okay, so I'm going to create a table with just ID and first name. I'm going to insert a few rows intentionally out of order. So 1 is Rob, 2 is Grant, who I don't think is here, and 3 is me. I keep wanting to press this to say go. I don't know why. All right, so I have 3 rows in my table. And if I say select ID first name from personnel and run it, I get it back in the results of the primary key. So people do this once when they create this table, and they write a query, and maybe their ORM does it, or they have a stored procedure, or they've put this code in their application, and they say, see, it comes back in primary key order. We're good. So now the results are always going to be ordered, and if I insert a new row, it's going to always be here. And if I insert a row after that, it's always going to be here. Every time I run this query that just says select ID first name from table, right, without an order by clause. Then some mean person comes along and creates an index on the first name, right? And now I run that same query again, and my results come back in a different order. And the reason is that SQL Server looks at the indexes available and says, hey, it's going to be cheaper for me to use this non-clustered index to return this data. And since the person didn't have any filters and didn't have an order by, it doesn't matter what order I turn them back in. I'm not going to be leaving any rows out. Here's all the data in the order of the non-clustered index. And you're going to say, well, the non-clustered index is the same size as the clustered index in this case because it has the key column, and then it automatically includes the primary key. Right? It has the key column in the index, which is first name, and then it automatically has the clustered index. But SQL Server thinks it knows that if you have a non-clustered index, it will always be skinnier than the clustered index. It can be no wider, right? But it will always be at least, it'll either be as wide or skinnier than the clustered index. If it has two non-clustered index to pick from, I believe you can treat it as a coin flip, but I think it picks the last index that was created. And I go through, you can download these samples. I go through a bunch of other cases where I just show that these things don't happen in a specific order, and you can't rely on that order to always happen. Okay, querying efficiently. So everybody has probably told you, don't use cursors. I use cursors all the time. They're very handy. And if you use a while loop, that's still a cursor. Don't think that you're avoiding cursors by using a while loop. They're the exact same thing. But if you have to use cursors, use the right options. There are some very efficient options for the cursors that most of us write, which are fire hose cursors, right? You're going through one row at a time, and you're doing something based on each row, and then you get to the end, and then you're done. You're not skipping backward, you're not skipping forward, you're not elevating that cursor so it can be used in a parent calling stored procedure. There are a bunch of default options with declare cursor that add a lot of overhead to the actual work that the cursor has to do. Everybody knows not to use select star in production, right? I mean, if you read the abstract, I already gave that one away. Please don't use select star. It's nice and handy for ad hoc stuff on your desktop if you're just like, you want to see what's in this table, but don't put it in production. It causes all kinds of problems. Count. How often do you select count from a table? You do that a lot, right? So you shouldn't actually need to touch the data to get a count. And the reason is, if I want an accurate count of what's in my table right now, well, I have that information in metadata, right? So there's sys.partitions and sys.dmdb partition stats, which maintains a pretty accurate count of the rows in the table. And the objection I get when I suggest that to people, I find this in people's code, and they say, well, I have to have that because it has to be accurate. And I'm like, well, does it? How accurate do you need it to be? If this is a busy table, right? You have a busy table, and you want an accurate count at some point in time. So you say select count star from table. It locks the table, right? You have to read the whole table to get the final count. So it locks the table. And if you're saying that this is a busy table, you have a bunch of inserts and updates and deletes happening against this table, right? What are they doing while you're counting? They're waiting. So you start reading this table. Let's say it takes you a minute to read a 5 billion row table or whatever, so, because you need an accurate count for a 5 billion row table. So you start counting, you start reading the table, and all these inserts and updates and deletes are trying to get at the table, but they're all blocked. So you get to the end, it took you a minute to read the table, and then as soon as you're done, you have a count. And then guess what happens? As soon as you get that count, by the time you read the number that came back from that count and have analyzed it and understood what it means, you've had 600,000 inserts, updates, and deletes happen to the table because they were all waiting until you were done getting that count. So how accurate is your count now? Not accurate at all. right? If it's not a busy table, you also don't need to be very accurate because the DMVs will be accurate, right? They miss out on transactions that are in flight, but if the table is not busy, there are no transactions in flight, and you can pretty much rely on the count that comes from the DMV. So go after the DMVs. The only case that doesn't work is if you need a filtered count, right? So I want to count all the rows in this table where isActive is equal to 1. So a filtered index can help with that. Or you have the inverse, right? You have a filtered index that says where isActive is equal to 0, if that's the exception. And then you can go to the DMV still and say, give me the count from the table and subtract the count from the filtered index. And that's how many don't match the filtered index. So you can still even get away with it with filtered counts at a very low cost, right? A filtered index on just the key column where some condition is true is not going to be very expensive if you use the exception, the one that's going to return the least number of rows. Right? And if you have a flag like isActive, that index will probably be handy if you're trying to look up deleted accounts or so on. Don't use NOLOCK like a blanket. I'm not saying NOLOCK it should never be used. It almost never should be used because there are a lot of things that can go wrong. You can get very inaccurate results. You can read rows twice. You can miss rows altogether. You can even have corrupted data inside of a row and inside of a column because of NOLOCK. But what I've seen is companies that have policies that say every single query you will ever issue against the SQL Server shall have a NOLOCK. And I think that's kind of bad. Pick group by over distinct generally. So what I found in several scenarios, if you're applying some aggregate to a column, maybe you're aggregating a string or getting a sum or whatever, and you have the group by columns. What people will do sometimes is they'll add distinct. Even without an aggregate, they'll add distinct to this to eliminate duplicates from a join or something like that. So if you are in a scenario where you have a query where you can choose between distinct and group by, I would always err on the side of group by. And the reason is that, at least in scenarios I've seen, and maybe Rob probably knows better because he's probably seen this a lot more than I have, but I've seen where group by will eliminate rows first. So if you have duplicates, it will eliminate the rows first, and then it will apply calculations that happen in the select clause, or in the join clause, or wherever else it's used. However, if you use distinct, that will be applied last, which means that if you have calculations, if you're concatenating a string, you're doing some string concatenation in the select list, and you say select column, column, and then this big concatenation, and you have a bunch of duplicates because you're joining people to pet names or something, the distinct will happen after. So all those calculations happen for all the duplicates, and then you discard most of them, right? Except for the one that is chosen as the one that stays. So it can be a lot more expensive to use distinct than group by. Distinct is easier because it's less typing, right? Again, this is a case where, thank you. This is a case where less typing is not necessarily better. Okay. So some cursor options. So I'm going to drop my buffers so you know I'm not playing any tricks. So I have a string variable, declare at I, sysname, and then a datetime2 variable. And the datetime2 variable is just being used to track how long it takes to run this cursor. I have a cursor that selects name from sys.allObjects and then cross joins to the first 50 rows from sys.allObjects. Or, sorry, some arbitrary number, or some arbitrary 50 rows from sys.allObjects. And the reason 50 is not really significant here. It's just what can run in enough time to demonstrate my point without being too long that you fall asleep. So very simple cursor, open C, fetch C into I. So I'm just fetching the name of the object into my string variable. And then I'm just appending to an empty string, right? I'm just performing some calculation against the string. Again, this is so that a little bit of CPU so that this takes some time instead of just going through the list and being very quick. Close, deallocate, and then measure how long it took. So let's see how long this takes. Almost 5 seconds, 4.7 seconds to go through the list of sys.all objects, cross-join to 50 rows of itself. Now, like I said before, if you have this case where you have a fire hose cursor, you just want to look at each row once, you want to go one row at a time, never skipping forward, skipping backward, doing all these fancy things, where update, where current of, performing some kind of update, using a global cursor so that it's available in other objects. You can use a local fast-forward cursor. These are keywords. There are a bunch of different keywords that you can use here. You can also experiment with static. There are a bunch of different options. But local fast-forward is the one I've had the best results with. And if I run the same cursor, and let me, again, so you don't think I'm playing tricks and benefiting from data that's already loaded into buffer pool. So I clear that all out. I run the same cursor with those local fast-forward options specified. And that ran in 1/5 of the time, right? Just under 900 milliseconds. So I cut 80% of the time that my cursor was spending just by specifying local fast-forward options I was using anyway. Yes, sir? Fast forward, so the question is, have I figured out what fast forward means? So from what I can tell, from my testing, it is a combination of read-only and forward-only. I know Books Online doesn't say that, but I believe that fast forward is read-only, forward-only. So you don't have to specify read-only if you're using fast forward, because it's already, that would be redundant. And you don't have to specify forward only, because if you have fast forward and you try to, actually, if you have fast forward specified and you try to do where current update, where current of, I think an error message comes back, and you definitely can't skip forward and backward if you use fast forward. But some people would. Yeah. Right? So fast forward is read only, comma, forward only. Okay. How much time do I have left? Like 5 minutes? So select star, one of the reasons I wanted to tell people to not use select star in a view is not because of performance, right? People say, oh, well, you use select star, that means you're getting all the columns back, and SQL Server has to go look up all the columns and get the column names and get the data types. Guess what? If you type all the column names, SQL Server still has to go look those up in the metadata and validate that the column names exist, check what their data type is. Like, it's no different, right? So the key to not using select star is not just to replace it with the full list of column names. It's get just the column names that you need to return, even in cases where you are returning all the columns, because you never know when someone's going to add an XML column or a geography column to a table, and suddenly that's going back to your application. All that data is going over the wire. Trust me, it's not good. Right? If your application is not expecting that data to come across, or even if it just ignores it, it's just a waste. So I'm going to create a table, and then a view against that table. Now my view is going to say select star from that table. Then someone comes in, and this might be someone else on my team or contractor or whatever. Someone comes in and says, well, these columns aren't really named correctly. I'm going to rename the columns so they make more sense. Right? So I've renamed the column B to C. And if we look back, A and B are both integers, right? So now the column that was supposed to be named B, these are terrible names. It doesn't really translate well because they're terrible names, but hopefully I get the point across. Someone comes in and says, well, we needed this column B. Actually, it was supposed to be a datetime column, right? So I'm going to add now that I've renamed column B to C, I'm going to add this datetime column called B. And I'm also going to add a unique identifier column to store a GUID, and that's called D. So now when I run this, now if I look at the table, if I look at the table, I've got my 4 columns, right? I've got A and C. C was B before. It's a second column. And then B, the new datetime column I added, and then my GUID column. But if I select from the view, so now let's say I validated that the table returns the right data, and I assume select star from table that's in the view will do the same thing, right? However, select star from the view still gives me A and B is the wrong data type. B is actually C. That's my integer column. So the view has stored the metadata of which column ID to go after, not the column name, which column ID. And it's cached that, and now when you call the view, it's still looking at the old definition. And it's getting the column ID 2. Remember, I pointed out that it was the second column in the list. That's column ID 2. And it's saying, give me column ID 2 and call it B. So you get around that by using refresh view or refresh SQL module. And now if I select from the view again, now it's correct. Right? There's a little trick that Remus Rusanu taught me to make people, or prevent people from using select star against a table. You got a computed column that says, don't use select star as 1 over 0. So if I add that, and then I say select star from dbo.x, I get a column name here. Don't use select star. Right. So just a little trick. I'm not going to demonstrate the count because I'm almost out of time. I do want to talk about this one last thing. SQL Server doesn't have undo, doesn't have Control-Z. You've got rollback transaction, but you had to begin a transaction in order to have that. So what I do is I have my new query template. When I'm opening up a new query, it has this code in here automatically. Begin transaction, and then commit and rollback commented out. So that if I say begin transaction and I start typing and I say delete from table and I forget my where clause and I delete 5 billion rows from a table, or at least start and hit stop when I realize what I've done, I can just roll back and save myself from getting fired. Right? Instead of having to restore from backups and tell the boss, hey, I've made this stupid mistake and I deleted a thing in production. I also like to use colors. So in Management Studio, you can specify custom colors for each of your connections. So when you're connected to production, you can have bright red flashing in your face and make sure that you're being very careful. This can bite you the other way, though, because I can say begin transaction, I delete rows from my table, and I've locked the table, and then I forget to highlight the commit or the rollback, and I go to lunch, or I go on vacation. Then I'm in big trouble, too. Right? So it can work both ways. But anyway, please be careful about interacting with data in production. That's all I have. I'm out of time. I'm going to ask again, did everybody get something out of this? Did anybody not get something out of this? Thanks for helping out. All right. Thank you for your time. I'll be here for the rest of the day, and if you have any questions, come and see me.